Hello and welcome to this session of CLS 2021, Why Are Families in Catholic Schools Leaving? Finances is only part of the equation. My name is Tom Gasper. I serve as a regional superintendent for the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. It's my pleasure to share some of the research findings I uncovered through my doctoral dissertation research. As we all know, the number of Catholic schools that have closed during this pandemic is of great concern to all of us. And yet for people like myself that have been in Catholic schools for many years, we've seen this continual trend of declining enrollment in our schools since the early 1960s. In fact, we see here from this statistic from NCEA that over half of the schools have closed since that time in the early 1960s. And what's most concerning to me is that the schools that are generally serving the most marginalized population are the ones that are at most risk of closing, those that have served the poor, those that have served the underrepresented, those that have really, quite frankly, often received some of the greatest benefits of Catholic education are no longer being served. And what we run the risk of is the survival of more selective or wealthy schools, which can be in conflict with Catholic social teaching. And so it's a great concern to understand what we can do to help improve the enrollment in our schools. Now, a lot of times when we're looking at enrollment management, there's a great emphasis on marketing. What are we doing to promote our schools? What are we doing to recruit new families? And how do we increase that admissions funnel so that more are coming into our school? And there are a lot of great resources and research studies, quite frankly, on what the great ways to market to the population that's not. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a downer if we're reading Going, Going, Gone, and we're reading about disaffiliation of Catholics. One of the research resources I like is this from Fatica and NCEA of 2018, the Catholic School Choice. They looked at market research with primarily Catholics that were not already in Catholic schools. So about 94% of the thousands of people that they interviewed they were Catholics, but not in Catholic schools. And so I really recommend that if you're trying to look at who to pull in that's not already in a Catholic school. This talk is not about that. This talk is actually looking at something that we don't think about as much, but it's a really important part of the enrollment management piece, and that's retention. Retaining our families that are already in our schools so that it does not lead towards attrition. And when I started my research 3 years ago, I had a hard time finding any kind of great statistics or data on attrition. And it makes sense, even though in Catholic schools we're challenged with retaining our families, it's not exactly something we want to proclaim to the public. And so it's been very hard to find local or national statistics. One exception to that was Loyola Marymount about 10 years ago started publishing a series of studies where they found that of this population of students that were receiving financial assistance from the Catholic Education Foundation, they looked at some of the longitudinal successes of those students, many great things, higher college matriculation. But one thing that was concerning that stuck out to me was that they found that 30 to 36% of these students on financial assistance in Catholic 8th grade did not continue to a Catholic high school. Even though we have a lot of Catholic high schools in Los Angeles, that rate of over a third of them being lost was of great concern. And yet there was no real reasons or knowing really what were those reasons. They were looking at a lot of different factors. So that wasn't part of that study. So I really wanted to kind of understand, why aren't they staying? So I just recently published, if you Google Gasper and a Catholic school attrition, you could probably find it pretty easily. It's all open access. But I'm going to share with you some of the findings from this dissertation today in a really simplistic way. So first of all, it's a mixed method study. So the first phase was looking at 610 Catholic 8th grade students. So students in Catholic school already or their parents. And then the second phase was looking or having follow-up interviews one-on-one with families who had decided they're not continuing in their Catholic education. So these 8th grade parents had made the decision to go to a different school. The research questions that guided me were, first of all, what are the main factors that Catholic elementary school 8th graders and their parents are factoring in choosing a high school? Is there some kind of relationship between Catholic elementary school satisfaction and their perceptions of Catholic high school and even their matriculation to Catholic high school or not? And then finally, to what extent do elementary school graduates and their parents' identified attributes correspond with attrition? or matriculation or lack thereof. And so those were three things that guided that. I'll share some findings with you on each of those. First of all, what was important to them as they were choosing a high school? So the context was the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. And just to let you know, we have 206 Catholic elementary schools. And to get that down to a manageable size, I used proportional stratified sampling. So I ended up with 25 schools that basically represented the same kind of demographics as the 206. So a lot of great geographic diversity all over Los Angeles County, socioeconomic diversity, ethnicity, gender, size, and also making sure that those particular schools prior year attrition fell in line with the overall aggregate of the whole Archdiocese of Los Angeles. So what was most important to these eighth graders and their parents? These are both going on to Catholic high school and not going on to Catholic high school, the whole group. Academic program, college acceptance, and safety were the three highest things. When you looked at some populations and some differences within, safety was statistically more important to Hispanic or Latino participants than wider other participants. And also clearly, understandably, it was also more important to parents than it was to students. So all the answers, I tried to look at what's important to the student, what's important to the parent. Kids were not as concerned about safety as mom and dad. Makes a lot of sense. Financial considerations were important overall. Every population ranked it to be important, but especially statistically among Filipino and Hispanic or Latino participants. As well as parents, every parent that had an income lower than $180,000 had significantly higher importance in that than those in the highest income bracket. Another piece that I think was really interesting about this research is that a lot of times we are concerned that faith values, maybe the value of faith is part of the reason why they're not continuing at Catholic schools. And I have to share with you, both those that were continuing and not continuing, place the faith importance and values and beliefs pretty high. So that was really comforting and a good thing to start off with. Parents overall, it was extremely important. Students, not quite as much, but still important to them as well. And then obviously a drop off a little less important to those that were matriculating to public high schools. Location was not as important to white, multiracial, and private school matriculants. So in an interesting way, you'll see some information. Instead of just looking at they went to a Catholic school or they didn't go to Catholic school, the population sample ended up being strong enough that I could differentiate between those that were going to a public or charter school versus those that were leaving to go to a private non-Catholic high school. So you'll see kind of three levels of matriculation there: Catholic school, a private non-Catholic school, and public school, which is an overarching group for traditional as well as charter schools. Athletics were certainly more important to students than parents. So in most cases, the parents rated every factor higher than the students, except athletics was much higher to students. Was not, surprisingly, not as important to parents as we might have thought. So think about that when you're doing differentiated marketing. Very important to students, not as important to parents, even though some parents probably drive you crazy with it. Single gender was, of all the factors, by far the least important of all factors among every segment of population. And so some really interesting things there. So, again, looking at your marketing, it's not to say that they didn't choose single gender schools. There's some great single gender schools out there that they were choosing for academics. They might be choosing because of programs or certain outcomes. But the factor that it was a single gender school itself as an eighth grader or for a parent of an eighth grader did not resonate as high as the other 9 values that they were choosing from, even from those that chose to go to a single gender school. Sometimes it's easier to just talk to the people that want to give you good news. I'm going to encourage us, as we're thinking about attrition, to really listen to the people that maybe have the biggest concerns with our school, those that are leaving. And so one of the questions in this research that I tried to find out is just segmenting the population that's not continuing in Catholic schools anymore and asking them, well, what are the reasons that you are not sending your 8th grade child, or what are the reasons you 8th grade child are not going to continue in a Catholic high school? And they were able to choose 1 reason, 2 reasons, 3 reasons. There were basically 12 options there when you count the other blank based on research. So the most high frequency out there based on research. And I think the number one reason why they're not attending Catholic school next year is not going to surprise you. You probably have a lot of knowledge. We can all guess. If we were together, we'd say it together, but we're not together. So expense. We know, we hear it all the time from our families. I'd love to go to your school. I'd love to stay in this school, but I just can't afford the tuition. It's too expensive. And so certainly that was the number one reason. In fact, over half of the respondents, students and parents, selected as the number one reason. So it certainly is really important for us to be looking at that. 3/4 of the population, again, not continuing in a Catholic school, chose it within the top 3 reasons. And it was selected by a majority of parents in every income level. So even that highest income of over $180,000, there was a majority of families that chose that as a reason. When we break down by income levels, you can see here, I was able to ask families anonymously, what was your income over your family household income over the past year. And so you see I've got groupings in $30,000 increments. And so while you might expect this over here, this end, and making the least amount of money to have the highest percentage of respondents saying money is the reason, the actual highest number came in here from these families making $60,000 to $90,000. So this is a really important finding for us to realize that the poor and vulnerable population that we are very concerned about, certainly there is a good, more than 2/3 of them or 3/4 of them are saying finances is a big reason. But going just a little bit further down the scale, you see a jump up here to almost all the respondents in that income range, $60,000 to $90,000. Remember that income level later. And then of course, as we look here on the highest income levels, we see less of them saying it, but still quite a large majority saying that finances is the reason, even though they're making, by some people's standards, much more comfortable living. Financial assistance is something I went a little deeper into, and I asked them to share any or all kinds of financial aid and awards that they're getting. So some of them were need-based awards. We talked about merit scholarships and broke that down for them. A couple different community foundations that are here on the local level for us, or they could check that no financial assistance or scholarships are offered. And overall, we found that 43% of the respondents were getting some kind of need-based financial award, and almost 60% were receiving when you include the merit and the need-based financial aid awards together. But again, when we look at it by income level, we see probably what we should at the first part, I hope, if we're really caring about our poor and vulnerable population, we want to see this number really high. So 89%, almost 90% of those making less than $30,000 indeed reported they were receiving a financial aid award. So that's great. And then we see it dropping down for the next level to 76 overall, or 68% when you just look at need-based. And then you see a pretty significant drop here when you get just a few $1,000s more in this next one, $60,000 to $90,000. It drops down to just over half if you include merit, or under half if you are going just on need-based aid. And so while that might sound like they have decent money for many people in a market like Los Angeles, where the cost of living is quite high, we are talking here about a lower middle income, kind of the beginning of that. So this is not somebody making a lot to live by with the way rents are and whatnot in Los Angeles. So I can see it to become a concern there. When we look at it by where the students were going, and so if we just look at the students going to Catholic schools, we see here that those families were getting about, almost 3/4 of them were getting some kind of aid, but a half of them were receiving a need-based financial aid. And then you see a drop off quite a bit for private schools, getting some kind of aid from a Catholic school, and then public schools receiving very little. Some things that though came out from the interviews in particular, I do want to share with you, is that many of our families that are leaving 8th grade didn't even bother to apply because they just didn't perceive that they would. They maybe applied for the local foundation award when they were in elementary school, and elementary school tuitions are much lower than high school. And so perhaps the threshold for financial aid might be different in an elementary school, either by their own school awarded aid or by a foundation. Versus a high school that maybe the tuition might be 2 or 3 times that amount. I also found that families that were interviewed perceived they would not qualify for financial aid. So in a lot of cases, they didn't even complete the application process because it was really a kind of a de facto thought. So it's really good thoughts for us to think about how we're marketing that, how we're being really open about the percentage of students that would qualify for aid, or other ways to kind of just get them to apply. Finally, there were a lot of concerns voiced about sometimes they were getting a merit award on the way in, and so it might have just been for freshman year, or even if it was a need-based financial aid award, there was some, concern from some families that it wouldn't be guaranteed for all 4 years. And so what would happen if my son goes to this school and then the school doesn't give them that aid? There was no guarantee of it. So something for us to think about, is there a way we could kind of use some kind of language in our award to say that, if it's a need-based award, given, comparable income in future years, you can expect a comparable award or something like that. And finally, locally, at least in Los Angeles, it was clear that sometimes some of the foundations or maybe a school, the awards weren't all lined up and made available to that family all at the same time. And so for some of those families, they found out later they got some more aid and it was too late, or this other fund was not available to them anymore. So a really good lesson for us to just make sure we're working really hard to give the families the best picture all at once together. And yet, as much as expense is the biggest reason, we also found that it's often one of many reasons of why students weren't coming to Catholic high schools. In fact, almost 80% of the population chose at least 2 reasons. So those of us that are used to kind of, maybe on an exit interview, we ask them we mark down maybe on our Excel sheet, or hopefully we have a better system to record that, what's the main reason? But almost 80% of them said there were at least 2 reasons. Almost half of them chose something else as number 1. So even though they might, have told somebody, oh, it's money or whatever, to make you feel bad, there was actually something else that they ranked number 1 for over half of them. And a quarter of them didn't even include finances at all in their top 3. So sometimes as Catholic educators, we can kind of almost say that as defense. Well, it's because of money, but this study really calls us to also look at, well, what else is going on in our school? What else is happening programmatically, or in the way that our families are feeling that they would leave? Remember, they were already paying tuition to be in the school in the first place. So yes, the tuition jumps at high school, but this is not a population where you have to sell them on this new thing of Catholic school. This is a family that's already been invested in it. So really trying to look at why they don't continue. One of the biggest reasons was specialized academic programs. And I think our Catholic high schools, for many years, at least locally, pushed really hard college acceptances, the rigor, and AP classes, things like that. But what this piece is telling us, this was not an indictment really on the overall general academic program. This was really about a specialized academic program that was attractive to that young man or woman and or his parents. And so in many cases, they were STEM fields, so like a special engineering cohort, robotics program, pathways for different careers, could have been medicine, could have been film and television in this area. And early college credit was also something that was very attractive to many of our parents in particular. One of the families I interviewed, the father said this one great school that he ended up choosing to go to in a public school, they have a great engineering program, which he got into. By junior year, they're interning at Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Things like that. They have a very advanced robotics program. They have other programs, Avid, and there's other stuff he was able to take advantage of. And at the same time, we would not have to pay. So it's kind of a big plus to that parent. Second most common reason was that the student, either because the mom and dad said or because the child said, they did not want to go to the Catholic high school. In fact, over a quarter of them said that. A quarter of respondents said that we're not going. It was one of their top 3 reasons. Some things that students and parents both shared were like, I want to be in a bigger school environment. I wanted to meet new people. I want to get a new fresh start. Some were more detailed. This one parent was sharing with me, you have 30 kids in this grade. They go all the way through. And her son would say to him, I feel like I was the weird kid in kindergarten. I could never get over it. And the mom really kind of acknowledged him at the end and said, you know what, he's kind of right. He did never really get a chance to outgrow that. The social norms were so established in that, single grade Catholic school that he really didn't feel like there was any way around it. Another parent said her daughter wanted to change socially, to be around different group of students, to help with the drama. Her daughter said, "There's too much drama." And the mom told her, but at a bigger school, sometimes there's bigger drama. So the mom really had already sent 2 kids to Catholic high school, believed in it, was worried about the cost of it. So again, it's cost and, but the fact that her daughter was kind of, done with her social circle in LA, we have a lot of Catholic schools nearby. And so it is possible to go to a school different from a lot of your classmates and reinvent yourself. But for a lot of our 8th grade students, they just didn't seem to sense that new beginning and open opportunity that this label was going to kind of follow them in some ways. And then finally, one of the students wrote, "Not the right fit, experienced too much exclusion and bullying." And that's just a hard thing for us to hear. We know the challenges of emerging adolescence and whatnot. But our Catholic schools work so hard at the social, emotional, spiritual care of our kids. So this was really a hard theme to see come up so often in the interviews of these things from their 8th grade experience leaving the school. Another common response was that location was too far. And even though I said there's a lot of schools on top of each other, LA is pretty diverse. And so there's some areas that maybe are a little more spread out. And so sometimes the school that they wanted to attend was not close by. And then the other thing that made it difficult that so many parents mentioned is if they could find a good nearby school and could get access to that through some special program, then that really impacted their decision as well. Some standouts, one particular parent said this particular school was a really big push for them, that they wanted their son to go there. It was just distance-wise far for them, and the expense, right? They have this great program, would have been great for me, great for him, but we don't live in that part of the city. So it's the drive and the money. So again, not one reason. And then if the exit interview was only one, which would it be? Would it be the location? Would it be the money? It's a combination of it for me. A few students actually said this, that in some cases, maybe the closest one or the only one that they could afford or something like that was single gender, and they were looking for a co-ed school for them personally. And then this other student shared that, I can't really have anyone take me to school. And so, that's really unfortunate. Feel badly for those kids that are missing out on this Catholic education. Next reason, athletics. And so sometimes we're feeling a lot of pressure in this. And so indeed, it was checked off as one of the 3 reasons by a fifth of the population. So that was not going on. So in one way it is. But on the other hand, I want to point out that it was the primary reason for only 6 participants. So, it was athletics and money, or it was athletics and something. So just as a point of reference, and again, as I shared earlier, athletics was more important to the students than the parents in this particular study. Visual performing arts, about 17% selected in their top 3. So one of the parents shared, again, a bigger school said that, our Catholic school had a little theater program. It had some performing arts, but there was this huge school that was really renowned for that. And not only did they have theater and productions, but they have an improvisation team, and it's competitive and all of that. And so I think, for some of these kids that really have a good sense of what their niche is, there are some schools that are able to provide maybe a deeper program than some of our smaller Catholic high schools. And then just giving you a little overview of some of the others, none of these statistically significant, but I was collecting this data in the spring of 2020. So just at the beginning of COVID, 2 months locally, we've been in distance learning for a couple of months. And so it started to become a more frequent comment that should fall 2020 begin with distance learning, I'm going to be looking for the best public high school that I can get my kid into at that point. And so we know a lot of our Catholic schools suffered enrollment dips this last year with the advent of distance learning, especially in Los Angeles, where we weren't able to get into school we were out of school for a full year. Another family kind of articulating this pull of maybe a non-traditional high school, so half homeschooling, half in-person classes. So some things are, maybe emerging to look at, but again, not the same level of collectively, there were to a fifth, but there were so many different answers in that grouping. I want to share a little bit about effectiveness. The national standards and benchmarks for effective Catholic schools are really this great signpost for a lot of us as to how we measure effectiveness in our schools, and looking at their benchmarks and trying to ensure we're using frequent surveying of our constituents to understand how we are maybe meeting or not meeting those benchmarks. So for this study, I wanted to look at effectiveness of our Catholic elementary and high schools from parent perspective. And to do so, survey fatigue would be a lot if I tried to get it all 13 standards. So I chose 7 of the 13 standards that generally are more externally understood by parents and resonated with their important areas, representing all 4 domains of the NSBECs. So the results of looking at that with Catholic elementary school satisfaction from the way out, first of all, congratulations. Families, both leaving and staying, generally overall had very high level satisfaction with their Catholic elementary schools. So that was great. Parents had a higher degree of satisfaction with the school than students did. Interestingly, I mentioned to you before, breaking down the population leaving Catholic schools, those leaving to go to a private high school rated overall effectiveness, leadership, academic instruction, facilities, equipment, technology, all statistically significantly lower than those going to a Catholic or a public high school. So it's a really interesting phenomenon that this population here is significantly less happy with their Catholic school experience, and thus matriculating to a private non-Catholic high school, as opposed to the public school population that generally rated their experience closer to the Catholic matriculating school population. Other things to know: sense of community was really valued. It's something we work so hard at in our schools. And when in the interviews, whenever I'd start with like, what brought you to the school? You know, the sense of community and talking about the early years and all of the care and love that they felt was phenomenal. But for many of them, that shifted a little bit as they continued to talk about the middle school. There was something that happened in the grades. Sometimes whatever happened also wasn't maybe dealt with the way that they wanted by the principal or the teachers, and sometimes even the mature parent could say, even if they did something different, I would have appreciated them getting my opinion or hearing from me. Or sometimes it was just a more general thing, like the only way they ever want to hear from us is for fundraising. And I'm a former development director, so I understand that we were really good at reaching out to them for those things. But there was definitely one of the biggest criticisms that came from the families interviewed was that sometimes the communication was just one way, and there wasn't a lot of authentic, let's listen to these parents as the primary educators and try to collaborate with them. So some improvement maybe for some schools. But interestingly about our faith, parents were generally positive about faith formation experience. But again, when they were going deeper into details, many of them talked about the quality and quantity of instruction in religious instruction to be waning in those later years. In that 7th and 8th grade, they weren't really learning much new. In fact, the minutes that the teacher was probably teaching 3 different things and would give away their minutes in religion to social studies or English or math or something like that. And so in some ways, a little bit of indictment that they're not sure that there's, the quality of religious instruction was that great towards the end, and what more is there for them to gain in the next couple of years of high school. Going on to the high school, some perceptions about that from these 8th grade students and their families. First of all, the public high school matriculating students and parents perceived the Catholic high schools to be less effective than those that were continuing in Catholic schools. So, and 7 of those 8 areas, the difference was significant. So in some ways, they are kind of voting with their feet a little bit. It's not just money. There is a perception from that population that maybe the Catholic schools aren't quite as effective. Private school, high school matriculating participants also rated those variables lower, but only the leadership was significant. And leadership was one of those things that was pretty interesting to look at. The parents' reaction to it was sometimes a little more critical than some of the other variables at the 8th grade level. Some takeaways also just from interviewing them to think about: first of all, most public high school parents did not complete the application process and did not ever attend one of those open houses. And by the way, this was before we were COVID. So that admissions year, they had, the regular on campus open houses and things like that that a lot of our Catholic high schools did. This is long before pivoting. So we've got to figure out ways to get to them in other ways rather than the traditional open house. And also there was a barrier in most cases that kept them from completing the application. The last piece I want to share about effectiveness is that when we looked at responses on how somebody viewed their elementary school experience in any of those 7 domains that are listed here on this screen: religion, faith formation, school leadership, academic instruction, the families that were highly positive about their elementary school experience in that were also most likely to be highly positive about the Catholic school perception of that. If the family tend to be more critical of their Catholic elementary school experience, even though the high school programs might be very different, they tended to view them the same way. Here you can see some correlation coefficients and high correlation on all of these. But you can see here that the parent correlation was higher than the students. So students maybe were able to differentiate a little bit more, like, oh, even though my elementary school is this, my high school might be that. Whereas the parents had really strong correlation, maybe not able to differentiate the two as clearly. When we break down the same results by where those students were going to school, we see some really interesting pieces here. This correlation coefficient of 0.51 for Catholic high schools is strong. So families that were feeling good about their Catholic elementaries were probably feeling really good about these high school programs as well. But then we move over to the population, again, that private high school, private non-Catholic high school population, they have significantly higher correlation between positive and positive or negative and negative. And so remember earlier, we talked about this was the group that was more critical of their elementary school experience than the others. And sure enough, they're matriculating to private high schools, feeling also more critical about the Catholic high school option as well. And then finally, even those going to public high school also had strong correlation. So it's really important for us to realize that we're in this together. And so as important as it is for high schools to be concerned about receiving and differentiating, they've got to strengthen that elementary school that's their partner, because what they're experiencing and how they leave elementary school is how they're perceiving those high schools. Even if you have robust sports programs or things like that that are very different, the 8th grade population and their parents aren't seeing that quite as clearly as you might think. The final findings I want to share with you are about this group of 610, their attributes, and how that played into their decisions. So first of all, there was a statistically significant relationship between ethnicity and matriculation. So you're going to see in a moment, certain ethnic groups matriculated at higher rates than others. Attrition generally was higher among BIPOC students than white students. It was highest among, the highest attrition was not from the poorest students, but actually from families of students making somewhere between $60,000 to $120,000 had the highest attrition. So maybe they're not getting financial aid. We saw that, the big drop in financial aid. And yet they're feeling like they don't have enough to be able to afford that. And finally, attrition was higher among female students than it was male students by quite a bit. So when you see this all broken down together, it's a little challenging to me as a social justice leader, because we see over here the highest levels of attrition in our Catholic schools are coming from multiracial families. They're coming from lower middle income families. They're coming from girls much more than boys. They're coming from lower income and BIPOC families. And on the other end, we've got relatively better attrition from high income, wealthy, white males. So we've got some work to do at understanding what are these barriers and how do we continue to make our schools more accessible and quite frankly, better serving the students while they're with us so that they won't leave and they'll continue. And finally, just a few quick recommendations, whether you're working at a diocese or you're working at a school site, we certainly need to be getting constant feedback from our constituents and making sure that we're using that data to impact ongoing school improvement. Even though it's hard and sometimes we don't want to hear it, we need to figure out what are the best ways to collect exit data. to analyze and respond to that and understand the attrition and matriculation trends. You may not be the best person to collect this data. There may be somebody else, but you want to make sure that it's set up so we can get the whole story, multiple reasons. I can tell you in my previous school where I served as president, at one point we had our school boards members actually doing the exit interviews with faculty and staff because they felt that it would probably be more objective for them to share that with a community partner that they don't know very well than perhaps to me, the leader, that maybe they might change their story a little bit. So think about that too from your parent point of view, like who's the best person to be able to get that information from the families to what really happened in that school. Finally, looking at how do we get better at TK through 12 collaboration. A lot of times we've been siloed and we're worried about our school, and this kind of survival of the fittest and silo thinking is not going to really work for our system much longer. We've got to be in this together, figure out not just how we do it at PD, but also really intentional partnerships and figuring out who can be paired with who to improve greater success for both. And then for a school site, just a few things to think about. How are we communicating with our parents? Is it two-way? How do they say we're communicating with them? Have them tell you. How do we strengthen that student sense of community, especially in those really challenging adolescent times? How do we build and promote specialized academic programs, and not just marketing, but really genuinely build these programs that don't just have some flashy name, but actually have some substance. Really looking at differentiating our marketing attempts, because what was important to kids was a little bit different than to parents. Looking at increasing our need-based aid. Don't want to take anything away from our lowest income families, but who can we partner with in our communities to also support some of the lower middle income families that we're losing at the greatest amounts. Increasing the promotion of financial assistance well in advance before, so kind of dispelling those myths that it's not going to be available. And finally, just making sure that we are taking care of those marginalized populations that unfortunately are leaving our schools at higher rates than many others. And finally, here are a few of the studies that I referenced during my presentation, as well as the template and the icons that I use through my license as well. Some of them are also public domain, so check those out if you'd like. It's been a great pleasure to spend this time with you today. Thank you for your commitment to Catholic schools. Please feel free to reach out to me if there's anything I can do to be in communication or collaboration with you. We've got to do this together, and God bless you in your ministry.